The sun had barely crested over the jagged outline of the Sierra Nevada when a thin ribbon of mist slithered above the canyon floor. In that trembling light, silence ruled the world, until the sudden sound of hooves broke the morning calm like a thrown stone shattering glass. A wild Mustang, black as volcanic glass and streaked with mud and scars, galloped along the canyon's rocky edge. His flared nostrils sucked in the cold mountain air, his muscles rippled beneath a matted coat, and his eyes, wide and wild, seemed to hold a memory too dark for a creature born of such freedom. He had no name, not one given by a human, at least. Among the herd he once belonged to, he was the ghost that didn't sleep, the shadow that disappeared before lightning struck. But now, even that herd was gone, scattered or broken by helicopters and steel pens. Far below him, crouched between boulders on the canyon floor, was a man who hadn't slept much either. His name was Clay Foster, a former search and rescue ranger whose gait had stiffened since his back injury and whose eyes carried the weight of lost things. His hair had turned silver before its time, and his worn flannel shirt bore tears, too clean to be accidental. He lifted a pair of binoculars, tracking the Mustang's furious pace across the high ridge. "There you are," he muttered under his breath, "still running from a world." Clay had been tracking the horse for over 2 weeks, but it wasn't for the Bureau or some rich collector. He wasn't chasing a prize. He was chasing a promise, to himself, and to someone long gone. The Mustang kicked up loose stones, sending them tumbling down the cliff. His ears twitched toward the sound, but he didn't stop. He was always running from the memory of a snare trap, the echoes of terrified braying, and the sharp crack of a rifle. He had escaped when no one else had, and he never forgave the world for it. Clay watched the Mustang pause at the ridge's edge. 55 feet below, the river sliced through the canyon in a wild roar of white water and foam. Clay's breath caught. He'd studied the maps, marked every drop and bend, and still, he didn't expect the horse to stop there. But the Mustang wasn't looking at the drop. He was listening. Somewhere down the valley, a distant engine echoed against the canyon walls. The sound was faint, but the Mustang stiffened. Panic clawed up his chest like smoke in a sealed room. His tail flicked once. Then, without warning, he backed up, turned, and disappeared behind a thicket of pines. Clay lowered his binoculars, jaw clenched. He knew what that sound meant. Roundup trucks. They'd found the trail too. And if they reached the ridge before him, they'd have one more broken horse to toss into the system. He stood, pain lancing down his leg. Time was gone. The race had begun. By the time Clay reached the base of the switchback trail, the sun had broken through the mist. He moved with care but urgency, scaling the narrowing path on his all-terrain quad, bouncing over ruts that sent spasms up his spine. Each jolt made him feel older, but he didn't care. He couldn't let them get him. Not that horse. Not that survivor. 10 years ago, Clay had lost his son to the mountains. A flash flood. A failed signal. A wait too long. By the time Clay had rappelled into the gorge, he'd found nothing but a boot and the shattered remains of a boy's promise. He'd resigned 6 months later, unable to look another mother in the eyes with hope. And then, one morning, from the window of his crumbling cabin, he'd seen the Mustang. He hadn't known what drew him to the animal at first. Maybe it was the scars. Maybe it was the way the horse didn't just run. It fled, like it had tasted death and knew its scent. Clay understood that too well. Now the path grew steeper, and so did the stakes. Above him, the Mustang broke through the tree-line again, back into view. This time, he wasn't alone. 2 men on horseback flanked him at a distance. Not wranglers, bounty catchers. They wore no uniforms, just spurs, ropes, and the kind of easy arrogance that came from never having to apologize to anything weaker. They moved slowly, boxing the Mustang in with subtle movements and clicking noises. The Mustang stopped, tossed his head, snorted. His hooves dug into the earth. He backed up, but they closed in, and one of them uncoiled a rope. Clay's pulse quickened. "Don't do it," he whispered. "Don't you even think about it." The cliff loomed behind the Mustang now. The river thundered beneath, cold and unforgiving. One wrong step, and bones would break before anyone could scream. But the horse didn't hesitate. He turned and leapt. For a second, the world froze. Not a breath moved. Even the wind seemed to go silent. Then impact. The splash echoed like a gunshot. Clay's heart stopped. He scrambled up the final rise, breathless and panicked, expecting to find a broken body below. The bounty men dismounted in disbelief, staring down as if the laws of nature had been rewritten in front of them. But in the river below, something moved. The Mustang, battered, soaked, but alive, was swimming. His legs churned against the current, and his head bobbed once. Then again, he fought the water with everything he had, steering toward a fallen tree that jutted like a skeletal arm into the rapids. Then, with one last burst of strength, he gripped the bank's edge and hauled himself onto the rocks, trembling and gasping, but whole. Clay let out a sound, half laugh, half sob. The bounty men looked at each other, spooked. One of them swore under his breath and turned his horse away. They didn't follow. Not now. The river had drawn a line they wouldn't cross. Clay, on the other hand, kicked his quad back into gear and turned toward the lower trailhead. He knew where that horse was heading now, into the old pine basin below the falls. If he moved fast, he could reach him first. As he drove, one thought took root in Clay's mind. This wasn't just a wild horse. This was a creature that had chosen death over a cage, and lived. And Clay wasn't going to let him run alone anymore. The pine basin lay shrouded in damp, blue shadow as Clay descended into its cradle. The river's roar had softened into a dull murmur, muffled by layers of needled canopy and mossy stone. Every few yards, Clay paused, listening. His boots sank slightly into the soft forest floor, still saturated from last week's storm. Somewhere ahead, he knew, the Mustang was licking his wounds in silence, watching for the next threat. He wouldn't come when called. He wouldn't answer to kindness. But he might, just might, remember a man who followed without a rope. Clay crouched near a cluster of ferns, scanning the trail for fresh prints. There, just beyond a fallen log, indentations in the wet earth, splayed deep and wide. The Mustang had passed through recently, and he was limping. A pang of guilt struck Clay. He'd wanted to save him, but now he wasn't sure if the leap had been survival or a last resort. Either way, the horse had landed in the world's margins now, and so had he. A soft rustle ahead caught his attention. He froze. Through the trees, not 30 yards away, stood the Mustang. His coat glistened darkly with water, his left foreleg trembling ever so slightly. But his head was up, ears forward, watching. Clay could feel the tension between them, a stretched wire of silence, one wrong move from snapping. Clay slowly removed his gloves and crouched lower, making himself small. "You're hurt," he said quietly, but not broken. The horse didn't flinch, but his breathing was labored. Steam curled from his nostrils like smoke. Clay didn't reach out. He'd learned that much. Trust was a currency earned in stillness and time, not gestures. So he sat, legs crossed in the damp moss, and waited. Minutes dragged like hours. The Mustang shifted his weight once, winced, then looked away, but he didn't flee. Clay felt his shoulders relax. That tiny act, of not running, meant more than any gallop. "You remind me of someone," he said after a while. "My boy used to run too. Fast, always chasing something bigger than himself." The Mustang flicked an ear. He was 16 when the flood took him. We were supposed to meet at the cabin that night, but I stayed out on a call, thought I had time. Clay swallowed, the familiar burn behind his eyes returning. I was wrong. The wind stirred the branches. The Mustang's tail swished, but he stayed rooted to the spot. "You're the first thing I've chased since," Clay admitted, voice low. "Not because I wanted to catch you, because I didn't want you to disappear like you did." A moment passed, then another. Finally, the Mustang took a step forward, only one, cautious and slow. His injured leg barely lifted, but the intent was there. Clay didn't move. He simply breathed and waited. The Mustang lowered his head, sniffed the air between them, then exhaled sharply through his nostrils and turned, disappearing behind a thicket. Clay stood carefully, not in pursuit, but in quiet recognition. The horse hadn't run away. He'd moved on, knowing Clay would follow. He did. They spent the next day and a half in silence, traveling in parallel. The horse remained at a distance, but never out of sight. Clay made camp beneath a dead cedar, cooking nothing that would carry scent. He spoke only occasionally, stories meant for ghosts more than horses. But something had changed, subtle and unspoken. The horse no longer saw him as a predator. Perhaps not yet a friend, but not the enemy either. By the second morning, Clay noticed the limp worsening. The canyon's sharp terrain had reopened a cut near the fetlock, and flies had found it. The Mustang swatted them with tired flicks of his tail, but seemed to lose ground with each step. Clay knew he had to act soon. He waited until dusk, when the forest turned golden and quiet. Then he unpacked a small satchel of herbs, a jar of salve, and a length of gauze. He didn't call out or coax. He simply laid them on a flat stone and stepped back, retreating to the shadows. The Mustang approached cautiously. His nostrils flared as he examined the strange offerings. He didn't touch the salve, but he dipped his nose near the herbs, recognizing their scent. Pain relief, familiar to wild instincts. He didn't flee, not even when Clay stepped forward, slow and open-palmed, showing no force. Clay knelt beside him, moving with painstaking care. The horse watched with wary eyes as Clay dipped a cloth into water and began cleaning the wound. His hands were steady, reverent. The Mustang flinched only once, but didn't bolt. Clay could feel the heat of infection, the pulsing beneath the flesh, and worked quickly. He packed the herbs in gently, then wrapped the leg with gauze, tying it loose enough to allow movement. When he stood, the Mustang looked him in the eye, really looked. And for the first time, Clay reached up and touched him. Just a brief graze along the cheek. The coat was coarse, damp, and warm with life. The Mustang didn't move. "You're still standing," Clay whispered. "So am I." That night, Clay didn't pitch a tent. He slept on the forest floor, near where the horse bedded down beneath the hollow pine. When he awoke just before dawn, the horse was gone, but only a short distance away, drinking from the stream, watching. The sky was beginning to change, but far down the valley, another sound echoed, a truck engine. Not a local. Clay's eyes snapped toward the tree line. Someone was still searching. Maybe the bounty men hadn't given up. Maybe someone new had picked up the trail. And this time, they were getting closer. Clay stood, heart thudding. He looked to the Mustang, who had also stilled, ears pinned. No more time. They had to move, and together. And Clay knew, without a word, that it was no longer him chasing the horse. It was them running, side by side, from the world. The trail that led them north twisted like an old scar across the mountainside, bordered by pine and shale, each bend hiding either promise or danger. Clay didn't speak much anymore. There was no need. The Mustang walked behind him now, not tethered, not forced, just choosing, step by step, to follow. His limp had lessened, the wound wrapped in cleaner gauze each night, and his eyes had changed. Less white around the edges, less fire, more question. Clay saw it in every sideways glance. The beginnings of trust, as fragile as the morning frost. But behind them, danger persisted like a stain they couldn't wash out. 2 days earlier, Clay had spotted the tire tracks, deep grooves from off-road treads carving through the softer mud below the timberline. More than one vehicle. Someone was still out there, combing the woods. Not rangers, not hikers. These were professionals, probably hired by those who lost the Mustang at the auction. Men who didn't take kindly to losing a prize worth thousands in black market racing rings. Clay had stolen from them, whether they saw it that way or not. And they'd want repayment, in blood or bone. They camped by a frozen creek that night. Clay lit no fire. The Mustang stood near the tree line, close enough that Clay could see his breath mingling with the rising mist. He lay back on the earth, arms folded behind his head, eyes fixed on the tapestry of stars. "I used to think life gave second chances," he murmured, voice barely above the wind. "Now I think it just waits. Watches to see if we'll take them when they show up." The Mustang flicked an ear, but made no sound. Clay didn't expect an answer. By morning, the world had grown colder, as if the forest itself knew what approached. Birds were silent. Squirrels stayed hidden. Even the wind moved cautiously, rustling pine needles like whispers between ghosts. Clay fed the Mustang a mix of oats and moss he'd foraged and crushed. The animal took it without backing away. They moved quickly through the narrow pass before sunrise. The cliffs narrowed, and the sky overhead turned gray with low clouds. And then a crack, not thunder, not nature, a gunshot. It echoed off the rock like the sky had split in two. Clay's legs kicked into motion before thought could catch up. The Mustang flinched, ears flattened, but didn't scatter. Another shot rang out closer. Clay ducked behind a boulder, heart hammering. They'd found them. No more running now. No more borrowed hours. He turned to the Mustang. The whites of his eyes were showing again, head darting, hoof stamping, but still he stayed. Another bullet zipped through the trees. "We need to move," Clay muttered, scanning the ridge. No way back. Only forward, and forward led to the falls. The ground sloped steeply ahead. Clay remembered it from old ranger maps. A chasm with a 50-foot drop into cold, churning water below. No trail, no bridge, no escape. Just the roar of the waterfall and a wall of sheer rock. He didn't have time to think about what they'd do when they got there. Branches snapped behind them. Voices now, too. Maybe 3 men shouting. Dogs barking. Clay ran. So did the Mustang. They burst through the underbrush, hoof and boot pounding rock and earth. The sound of water grew louder, closer, wilder. It wasn't a river anymore. It was fury, white and merciless. Clay skidded to a halt at the edge, arms windmilling to keep balance. The Mustang stopped beside him, breath heaving. Below, the water thrashed between black rocks. Behind them, the shouts closed in. Clay turned to the Mustang. The horse's muscles tensed, ears pinned, nostrils flaring. They both knew there was no going back. "Go," Clay said, voice cracked. "If you trust me, go." The Mustang hesitated, legs dancing backward. His eyes locked on Clay's. Another gunshot split the air. And then, the horse leapt. Not a scramble, not a fall. A leap, full-bodied, hooves arcing. A line of motion so clean it stole the breath from Clay's lungs. He watched the Mustang sail over the edge, swallowed by mist. And then silence. Clay stepped forward, peering down. Nothing. Just spray and rocks, and the endless roar of water. His knees buckled. Breath punched from his chest. For one terrible moment, he thought he'd killed him, that in trying to save the horse, he'd only sent another soul to the depths. But then, from the foam movement, a shape, struggling, thrashing, fighting the current. The Mustang was alive. He was swimming. Clay blinked tears from his eyes as the horse's head bobbed, then steadied, angling toward the far bank. He kicked, flailed, then found a rhythm. Strength surged from somewhere deep inside him, and slowly, inch by inch, he pulled himself from the water and onto a rocky shelf downstream. Clay grinned, wide and broken and wild. The horse shook, water spraying like diamonds in the sunlight. And then the men arrived behind Clay, shouting, weapons raised. He didn't hesitate. He leapt. Air rushed past his face, his ears, his heart. Cold slammed into him like a wall of steel. The world spun. Then darkness. Then bubbles. Then the light. Clay surfaced, coughing, choking, fighting. His limbs screamed. But the river carried him where he needed to go. The Mustang stood waiting downstream, head high, water dripping from his mane. Clay crawled ashore, dragging himself onto stone beside the horse. The sound of the men above faded into the roar of the falls. He looked up into the Mustang's eyes, and for the first time, there was no fear there. Only recognition, and something that almost looked like loyalty. Clay lay back, chest heaving, eyes closed. The battle wasn't over, but for now, they had each other. And the world, for once, didn't seem quite so unforgiving. The waterlogged trail ahead shimmered under a cold sun, steam curling upward from damp moss as Clay and the Mustang pressed deeper into the wilderness. Days had passed since the jump, and the men with guns had not returned. Either they gave up the hunt, or they were biding their time. Clay knew better than to believe in luck, but he also knew when to let his muscles unclench and his breath deepen. For now they were free. But freedom in the mountains had a price, and winter was coming. The Mustang had changed. He didn't just follow anymore. He walked beside. His head was no longer held high in suspicion, but lowered in a kind of weary acceptance. He no longer flinched at Clay's touch, When Clay whispered words during their evening rests, the Mustang would sometimes tilt his head, listening as if remembering some ancient language buried beneath instinct. Trust, once fractured, had begun stitching itself together, not all at once, but thread by patient thread. Clay gathered berries one morning beneath a frozen thicket and caught the Mustang watching him. Not warily, not in judgment, just watching, as if trying to understand the strange creature who had pulled him from captivity only to ask nothing in return. He offered a handful of the berries. The Mustang sniffed them, hesitated, then gently took them from Clay's open palm. The moment was small, but it rooted deep. Later, they crested a ridge and found what Clay had been searching for, a hidden valley tucked between sheer cliffs, dense with trees and fed by a spring that still ran clear and unfrozen. He remembered it from decades ago, a ranger's haven once used during wildfire seasons. It was remote, invisible from above, and nearly impossible to approach without knowing where to look. A place to heal, a place to wait out the snow. They set up camp beneath an old lean-to built into the stone wall. The roof sagged, but the bones were solid. Clay repaired it with fallen branches and bark. The Mustang helped in his own way. Hauling bundles of grass, Clay strapped to his back, stamping the snow flat around their shelter, standing guard each night, while Clay slept light and dreaming. Time slowed in the valley. They found a rhythm, rising with the sun, working through the frostbitten air, feeding on dried roots, berries, and occasional fish Clay snared in the icy stream. Each night, Clay spoke to the Mustang in a soft, rhythmic voice, telling him about wars fought, lives lost, and how not all scars stayed on the skin. He spoke of the horse he once had as a boy, a paint named Tilly, who never let him fall. He spoke of the woman he'd loved and lost, and how silence sometimes grew too heavy to carry alone. The Mustang listened. One night, a fierce wind howled through the canyon. The shelter groaned. Snow swirled at the entrance, and something in the darkness beyond moved. Clay sat up. The Mustang was already standing. A shadow emerged from the trees, a lone coyote, gaunt and limping, drawn by the scent of food. Clay stood slowly, grabbed a stick from the fire. He stepped forward, cautious, warning the creature off. The Mustang stepped between them. Ears flat, head low. He issued a sharp snort that echoed off the rock. The coyote paused, then retreated, swallowed by night. Clay stared at the horse, heart thudding. "You protected me," he whispered. The Mustang blinked, then turned away, as if it hadn't mattered. But it did. Days became weeks. The snow thickened. The valley turned white, and silence pressed in like a second skin. But inside that stillness, something bloomed. Connection, resilience, something more than survival. Clay felt it in the way the Mustang nuzzled his shoulder without fear, in the way he rested near the fire instead of apart. One evening, while brushing the dried mud and burrs from the Mustang's coat, Clay noticed something strange beneath the grime. Faint, parallel scars across the horse's flanks, long and symmetrical, like brands not meant to be seen. He washed them clean and stared. Letters. A code, faded but unmistakable. The Mustang wasn't just any auction horse. He belonged to a military unit, a ranger division. Clay's mouth went dry. He remembered a report from years ago, a program that trained Mustangs for search and rescue in war zones. Few survived. Fewer still were ever accounted for once the funding dried up and the horses were sold off in silence. Clay knelt beside him, hand trembling on the horse's neck. "You were a soldier," he murmured. "Same as me." The Mustang looked back, eyes dark and endless. Not just any horse. A veteran. Clay sat long into the night, staring into the fire, thoughts spinning. If the wrong people found out, they'd come again. Not just for money, but for secrets. That horse carried more than blood and bone. He carried history. Clay knew then he couldn't hide in this valley forever. They had to leave. The world needed to see this horse for what he was, needed to understand what had been thrown away, forgotten. And so the decision was made. At dawn, they would break camp, head west through the mountains, find someone willing to listen, a reporter, a vet, a judge, someone with a voice louder than a bullet. Clay watched the Mustang sleep, body curled against the wind. His ribs still showed beneath the coat, but his breathing was deep, steady. This was no longer a horse running from chains. This was a horse rising from them. And Clay. Clay was no longer just a man trying to right a personal wrong. He was a witness, a partner, and maybe, at last, something like a friend. Outside, the wind howled again, cold and wild and eternal. But inside the valley, a fire burned, and its glow. A new journey had already begun.